Welcome everyone to our next program for the HWA's Halloween in July. So I am pleased and honored to be here with award-winning author Dacre Stoker, where we will where hello Dacre, where we will be doing Dacre will be presenting a audiovisual presentation on the writing and research of Bram Stoker. So, Dacre, thank you for being here and for helping us to raise some support and awareness for the HWA scholarship programs. Um, so, without further ado, we will get started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Max. It's a worthy cause, and all the people, not sure how many are watching this today, please get behind this cause and donate, and let's help raise the profile of this great scholarship program. So again, without further ado, I'm going to give you guys a presentation I do all over the world. I'm always tweaking it. So a couple of new little bits and pieces. And if I could ask Angela to share the screen, and we're going to get going with the mysteries behind the research and writing of Dracula. All right, so I hope you can all see the screen just fine. I start with one of my favorite quotes from the novel. There are mysteries that men can only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part. And this is a quote that I think sums up a lot of Bram Stoker's own life and his writing of Dracula. We are 127 years into this novel. It was published 1897, and we're still finding interesting things about his life and about his research and writing of Dracula. I've been at it 12 years, so I'm thrilled to be sharing with some of these things with you tonight. So let's kind of get into it. How I have approached this is a term that I've coined myself as a literary forensic detective. I've decided to dig as deep as I can into Bram's life through looking at the Dracula notes that live in the Philadelphia Rosenbach Museum, the Dracula typescript that is owned by the Paul Allen estate out in Seattle, Washington. I'm one of only, I think, about 6 people that have had a chance to analyze it. I was lucky enough to find Bram's lost journal in his great-grandson's attic, my cousin's attic on the Isle of Wight, and published that with Elizabeth Miller in 2012. Recently, the books that Bram used for his research were discovered in the London Library, and I will walk you through how that interesting discovery was made and the revelations that I have found from the marks and the margins that Bram made. Also, I'm privy to Stoker family papers and insight, as Bram does have 2 great-grandsons still alive. And also, I've been lucky to get all sorts of insight from other researchers, scholars along the way. During the process, I've co-authored a couple of books. You can see them down below: Dracula the Undead with Ian Holt, The Lost Journal with Elizabeth Miller, and Dracula with J.D. Barker. And more recently, Robert 18 Basang, who passed away just about a year ago. The annotated Dracula for the 125th anniversary has all kinds of very interesting information about things that were left out of the novel, the first 3 chapters, things I discovered in the notes and in the typescript. So just to kind of put things in perspective, though, when you really think of Dracula and its enormity in literature and in horror in particular, and also in popular culture, you need to sort of look back at some of the statistics associated with the novel. Over 1,000 editions in 30 languages. That means it pretty much covers the world. It has never been out of print since 1897, and it went into public domain in 1962. And that means that none of the Stoker relatives, the great-grandsons, get any more royalties. It also makes it very easy to publish all over the world, which is a nice thing because it just helps it flourish everywhere. Over 700 movie citations. That's a Dracula character in over 700 movies since, of course, Nosferatu in 1922. And at least 1,000 comic books and stage adaptations, and these things are still counting. I look at these incredible statistics, and I also love to look at the book covers and the artwork that goes into them. And I draw your attention to the picture over on the right-hand side, the Dracula, the mustard yellow color with the red writing. And that is a first edition. And that came out in 1897, Archibald Constable in London. And just as a sort of an interesting discussion point, And I know you guys can write answers in the chat box, and Angela's going to control these. And when this talk is over in about 55 minutes or so, we can go into these. So here's your chance to answer this one question. Does anybody know the significance of the yellow cover of Dracula on the middle row, right-hand side? And I'm going to answer that question later. It's very specific. It's not just some plain old yellow cover that they didn't have a better graphic artist, but it is a very specific reason. So that's your question. Think about it, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. Directly across from that, the one that has the two kind of Scotch tape marks on it with the Dracula going down the wall, that's the first paperback edition that came up in 1901. It was also abridged. It's one of my favorites because it's got the scene on it where Jonathan Harker, and if you look just in the top right-hand corner of that image, you see Harker looking out over the window, and Dracula's coming down the castle wall. And at that point in the novel, I believe in chapter 3, he's realized that there is something dramatically wrong with the situation he's found himself in. And this is actually a supernatural event that is happening, and the count is not all that he thought it was when he set out from England. So it's kind of like the jig is up, and now I got to deal with this stuff. And that's what I love about these covers. They all tell a bit of a story from where they came from. Now, further, we all know, and we're all authors here, and it's strange in a way that many people look at success of your book by if it's been purchased, the rights have been purchased, and it's turned into a film or streaming or been adapted on stage. And of course, Dracula started in 1922 with Nosferatu, and it was on stage in that year as well. And then 31, it started going crazy with film productions, Bela Lugosi and onwards. And it's been adapted and readapted many, 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 many times. I'm going to show you just some interesting examples of that in this film clip. It's one of the cool perks that I get every now and then is being invited to go to different places to talk about Bram Stoker's research and writing of the story and how it's been impacted by film. So enjoy this collage, montage of film images from a film festival in Granada, Spain, just a few years ago. Uh-oh, sorry about that. Let me see if I can't bring this back to you. What just happened? Oh, sorry, guys. I got to figure out what just happened. Max, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, man.
Okay, so I just pressed the button to try to hide something, and that made an error. So let me just get to the next slide, which I apologize for. And
No worries.
here we go. Okay, so what I wanted to say about those film clips is it just shows the incredible variety and interpretations that people have gone through for many years to reimagine the story, and that's okay. To me, it's okay. I will say that I think the 1977 version of done by the BBC with Louis Jourdan is the most faithful movie adaptation, and the 1992 Coppola version is probably the most successful. And there's lots of other variations in between. But the important thing is it's part of the legacy of the story, and it keeps it alive. People are still interested in the story 127 years later. But let's look where it all started. Let's look at Bram Stoker, for instance, and see where he came from. And you'll see how things in his own life were actually woven into the fabric of the book itself. So he was born in 1847, which we call Black 47, because Ireland was coming through the results of potato famines and cholera epidemic. It was really a horrible time in Ireland. It was also a bad time for a little boy to be born who wasn't expected to live. For the first 7 years of his life, he was stricken by some mysterious illness. He luckily did recover at the age of 7, and he got homeschooled. His physical side of him dramatically caught up to his emotional kind of experiences that he went through, and he became a champion athlete at Trinity College over the years that he was there between 1864 and 1870. He actually was a star on the sports field, winning many awards, and also a star in the philosophical and the historical and the debating societies. He was the head of both the Phil and the Hist, which is very unusual. He worked at Dublin Castle part-time for the first few years. Then he went full-time when he became a petty sessions clerk. And then he actually got the promotion to become the inspector of all clerks of petty sessions throughout all of Ireland. So he traveled all over Ireland in a train, in a carriage, went to different places to make sure all the clerks were doing everything that they were supposed to be doing. And he found out that they weren't, that the whole petty sessions legal department was in great disarray. And you're going to see in a little while that Bram did something about it. He actually wrote a manual that was in use until 1962 for all clerks throughout all over Ireland. He married Florence Balcom in 1878. She had been dating Oscar Wilde earlier in her life, but ended up finding better prospects with Bram Stoker, mainly because he had just got the job offer to move from Dublin to London, England, to help run the Lyceum Theatre for Henry Irving, who became the most famous Shakespearean actor of his time. And Bram did that for 27 years. Bram wrote Dracula over a 7-year period, sort of in between all his duties at the Lyceum Theatre. He wrote 12 other books and numerous short stories and articles throughout his life. So he wasn't just a one-hit wonder. And he died April 20th, 1912, the same week that the Titanic went down. As you can see on the screen, he had many friendships with very interesting and influential people. Lady Jane Wilde, Oscar Wilde's mom, was a literary mentor to Bram. Walt Whitman as well. The writer Winston Churchill, up-and-coming politician at the time. Paul Kane was actually a very famous writer, much more famous than Bram ever was, until his Dracula surpassed all of Kane's works. Paul Kane is the guy that Bram actually dedicated Dracula to. And then Prime Minister Gladstone was a good friend, and he was a guy that received, actually, Bram gave him a copy of Dracula. Mark Twain was a neighbor of Bram's. You're going to see more about him later. Teddy Roosevelt who was the head of police of New York, went on to become the president of the U.S., a good friend. And then Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, Sherlock Holmes writer, was a good friend of Bram's. And they worked together to get one of Conan Doyle's short stories into the Lyceum Theater. So he was a well-rounded guy, Bram was. And as you know, Dracula obviously didn't really get that popular until long after Bram died. He died in 1912. As I said, Dracula got very popular once it started hitting the stage and the screen. But what were some of the influences in Bram's life? His early life, when he went off to Trinity, he was influenced by his mentor professor, Edward Dowden, who was the head of Philosophical Society at Trinity. He was also an authority on the occult, which, when you think about it, is not sort of, just sacrificing black cats on Friday the 13th. It's really the study and the interest in the other world, other than what strict religion was telling people about life and death. So it was something that Enlightenment was sort of challenging people to look at. Hester Dowden, Edward's daughter, was a spiritualist, a medium who was most notable, as I write here, for having claimed to contact the spirit of Oscar Wilde, and she wrote a book about it, which was very well received. Now, I mentioned Mark Twain was a neighbor of Bram's. I know he's very interested in spiritualism, and I am just convinced that Bram and Mark Twain had many interesting conversations about spiritualism and certain things, and this is one that Bram actually inserted into the novel. So in the book Roundabout the Equator, Twain writes, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." Bram took that sentence and just modified it a little bit and used it in Dracula. When Van Helsing is trying to get the scientist, Dr. Seward, to understand beyond his limited mind, beyond just the scientific medical process. And this was all focused around Lucy and her blood being drained. So they give her the transfusion on one day. She would go to sleep. Next day they come back. There was no pile of blood lying around, but she was still out of blood. And they couldn't understand this. And Van Helsing was trying to get Seward to think outside the box. And he says, you got to believe. You got to have faith. And Seward said, what do you mean I have to believe? Believe in what? He said, I once heard of an American who so defined faith as that which enables us to believe things we know to be untrue. That's exactly what Twain said. Faith is believing what you know ain't so in Roundabout the Equator. So you can now understand that Bram Stoker had such a good relationship with Twain and believed in some of the things he said that he inserted that line into the novel in a very appropriate place. A nice little homage. Also, you've got to realize that when Bram was writing Dracula, what was going on in the world around him. And Bram had a very unique perspective on this. Being a theater manager, he knew what sort of Victorian sensitivities would trigger people's interest and their excitement to go to movie theaters, to read his book. And as I mentioned, there was sort of a second enlightenment going on. This whole idea of questioning religion. Charles Darwin had just come out recently with the whole concept of evolution and published his book all about evolution. And this was really rocking the scientific world, rocked the religious world. And Bram was trying to do the same thing with Dracula. And he wrote the book in the epistolary style that made the story resonate as it's possibly being real. He used real places, real people, real events, and made the story really, real scary. Just to sum it all up for you. This was his tactic. This is what he did on purpose. Now, before we go a whole lot farther, if you look at this picture on the left, I actually hired an artist to actually take a look at the description that Bram wrote in Dracula and how would that be depicted by an artist. And that's, as I've got here, Dracula as he looked in 1897 to Bram Stoker. And then, of course, 1931 rolls around and Bela Lugosi is on stage in the 20s, and he goes on film in 31, and then, of course, Frank Langella in 77. And we see this humanization, this sort of aristocrat, this sort of sexy aristocrat emerge. And, of course, I could have put up, 100 other slides of images of different actors who portray Dracula, and you'd see much more of a humanization wearing fancier clothes, and also more skin, more chest hair, as Langella did. And one of the reasons I have both these guys on screen is that they were both on stage and on screen, which is interesting. So the two actors that played Dracula on stage and on screen. Now, as we all know, got to give credit to mothers. They raise good sons. And in this case, she was a very interesting person. And I am convinced that she was one of the models for Mina, as was Bram's sister a little bit. That's why J.D. Barker and I used Matilda as a main character in Dracula. But think of Bram's mother for a moment. She was a mother of 7. She was a social activist. She actually presented papers to the All-Male Statistical and Social Inquiry Society in Dublin, which was not an easy thing for a female to do, on the education of the deaf and the mute. Also, how to judge if somebody was criminally insane. So think of the influence on Bram and him inserting the whole concept of mental asylums, the treatment of people in mental asylums, and of course the character Renfield in Dracula. I'm sure it was influenced by partly his mother, and also, as you'll see in a little while, his brother Thornley Stoker as well. She survived the 1832 cholera epidemic as a young girl, which was horrifying. She wrote a story that Bram actually had her send to him, type it up and send it. You'll see a page of it in just a moment. And it was part of the bedtime stories, along with other Irish folklore and the mythology, that she inadvertently probably scarred this young boy and helped create a very dark sense of imagination to this young boy when he was holed up in his room for 7 years and needing to be educated and entertained. But that story of the cholera epidemic is horrifying. We'll get to that in just a minute. Bram didn't write an autobiography. As a matter of fact, he didn't write much about himself, but in one book that he wrote called Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving when Irving died in 1905, he wrote this book that actually became the only bestseller when Bram was alive. And he writes a few things that refers to himself. And in this one, he said, in my babyhood, I understand, to be often at the point of death. Certainly till I was about 7 years old, I never knew what it was like to stand upright. I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts, which were fruitful according to their kind in later years. There's a picture of Bram at 7. So he said he made this statement many years later, but he was looking back at the time of his illness. And I'm sure if you read between the lines here, I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts, which were fruitful according to their kind in later years, involved all the stories he was told and the nightmares that the poor boy had. And I think that helped create the dark sense of imagination for him to write Dracula. So here's one page of the Trinity College archives of the cholera horror story that Bram's mother wrote to him at his request after hearing the story years earlier. But she moved off to Caen, France with the 2 girls, 2 sisters of Bram, so they could be educated in the arts. And in 1873, he asked his mom to type it up and send it to him. And he actually used that to get in his mind what the cholera epidemic really, what it was and how it happened, and all the people it horrified. The picture down in the middle with the hand sticking out of the coffin is about a man who had cholera and was misdiagnosed and buried prematurely. The same exact thing happened to one of the neighbors of young Charlotte Stoker at 12 years old, and when she experienced all this. So you can see some of the horror and what it looked like. People dying. They had no idea what was causing the cholera. People were just fed laudanum, which is a type of oral morphine, just to ease the pain. They couldn't fix people. They couldn't correct the problems associated with cholera. They just tried to give them pain this last few hours. So what Bram did with this story that she sent to him, as if misery loves company, Bram used it in the first book that he wrote, Under the Sunset, 1882. He used it in the story you see on the left of your screen, The Invisible Giant. And this was a story of some sort of a giant, invisible, a plague, so to speak, an epidemic that took over the town, much like cholera took over Sligo in Western Ireland, much like we experienced COVID ourselves. So I can sort of understand this unknown invisible giant and how it just wreaks havoc over people. I believe that this is where one of the quotes came from that Bram used. There are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. I believe Bram suffered as his great-grandsons mentioned that it was known to the family that he suffered bad nightmares throughout his life. Well, most creative writers do, which is kind of interesting and strange. Interesting dreams that help us if we can remember them, write them down later on. So I looked deeply into the illness that did cause Bram all this consternation for 7 years, and I found that one of his uncles, Dr. William Stoker, actually was a famous fever doctor, and he was famous for using bloodletting as a tool for almost everything. Now, I don't have proof of this, but I think Bram Stoker was probably bloodlet during those 7 years of his mysterious illness. And if that's the case, you can see diagrams of leaching and cutting in different parts of the bodies and on the veins and arteries that would take out the necessary amount of blood. They had no idea what they were doing. They were simply taking out blood, which they thought was containing all the four humors, the good and the bad. What I found out when I read this treatise that William Stoker wrote, that not only you take out amount of blood until the patient would pass out, but you'd actually rehydrate them with a mixture of claret, which is red wine, and oil. So this would obviously make the guy pretty drunk if he had enough blood taken out to pass out. You rehydrate him, not with juice like we get when we give blood at the Red Cross, but with red wine. So I'm sure this kind of stupor maybe contributed to Bram's outlook on the world when it comes to giving blood. Now, here's a little bit of my connection to Dracula. As I said, parts of the things in Bram's life woven into the fabric of the novel. Chapter 4, when Jonathan Harker discovers Count Dracula lying in a coffin, or in a crate, actually, and he tries to kill him, but the glancing blow of the shovel doesn't do its job. But he writes, when he sees the Count, it seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. That's either first-hand knowledge or just good storytelling. I like to think it's a bit of both. If Bram had that experience, it would make it very easy to describe how he saw Count Dracula, a filthy leech exhausted with his repletion. So let's go a little bit further into Bram's life and see how things that he did contributed to the novel. He was, as I mentioned earlier, a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department. He wrote the manual you see that just popped up here, 1879, a legal manual, still in use till 1962. Well, look closely. Jonathan Harker was a young solicitor who had to deal with a real estate transaction of the Count. That's why Harker went over to Transylvania. His job was to consummate all the land transactions. There was also a lot of legal matters that the Count was asking Harker all about. How do you ship all these boxes? How many different types of lawyers do you need to ship supplies to England? And when the cargo was shipwrecked in Whitby, how do you deal with it? How does it get off the ship and onto the trains and doesn't become property of the Coast Guard? What are the laws involved? And then, of course, when Mrs. Westerner dies, the same time Lucy dies, about the complexities of the will and so on. So lots of little legal things are sprinkled into Dracula, and now you know where they all came from. Bram was actually called to the bar. That means he was asked to write the exams to become a barrister. He did, but he chose not to practice law because he had such a good job and he loved his life running the theater, and it gave him time in the summer holidays to write his novels. And here is the guy that really did contribute to both his second career as a theater manager, Sir Henry Irving. Bram wrote a theatrical review about him in his spare time when he was in Dublin, and this got him a meeting with Irving at the Shelburne Hotel, and both of them stayed up all night long in 1877 and talked all about the future of the theater. And Irving said, I'm making a move on renting a theater. I would love for you to come and be my manager. You're the right guy. Bram had a master's in mathematics, and also his love of theater, his legal side made the perfect match. So within a year, Bram packed up and went to London. And here you see a picture of him and Irving walking out of the Lyceum Theater, both of them tall men. But what's interesting is, with all of Stoker's help, organizing the theater, making it profitable, creating all kinds of duties and proper sort of appointments to all the actors and the actresses, they elevated the role of the theater in society to the point where Henry Irving became the first ever actor ever knighted in 1895, and Bram got a lot of credit for that. Also, what I think is a closer connection even is the role that Henry Irving played of Mephistopheles in the play Faust, which was the second most popular play that Irving played, in the first being The Merchant of Venice. That was a role that I believe was etched in Bram's mind when he was thinking about writing his character, Count Dracula, is the image of the devil, the Mephistopheles character in the play Faust. And when you look at the descriptions that Bram wrote, the way he described it, I believe he was describing Henry Irving's face in this role of Mephistopheles. And he was a devil-like creature. And I'll show you that in just a moment. And here's my sort of, I say it's proof, but here's my backup for this. Now look carefully at this page, folks. What you're going to see is one of the pages of the Dracula typescript. Now I got access to this, not because the Paul Allen escape allowed me to take a photograph of the page. They actually wouldn't. But I got permission from the catalog that it was offered up in for auction. And I had to pay for access to this page. But what caught my eye, and J.D. Barker's when we studied it, were all the things crossed out. That those never got published. And in this particular line, on the scene, when Dracula's having his way with Mina and doing the blood exchange, the band of heroes breaks into the room, tries to save her. This is how Bram Stoker described the scene that never made it to press. Even at that awful moment, with such tragedy before my eyes, the figure of Mephistopheles, the opera cowering before Marguerite's lifted cross, swam up before me. And for an instant, I wondered if I were mad. Further and further back, the Count cowered, whilst crossed out as we were lifting our crucifix as we advanced. You can see that crossed out, and you can see that Bram planned to have the image, the name Mephistopheles in the opera mentioned in the novel, and it didn't happen. I don't know why. It's too bad, but it proves my point that Bram was thinking Mephistopheles at the time of writing. Now, here's another interesting thing that Bram did. As the manager of the Lyceum Theater, he brought the whole troupe, 100 of them, to America 8 times. This is one of the train routes that Bram mapped out. So he bought a map and wrote on it with all the stops and all the train routes and the distances, 82 miles to one inch, showing where the tour would go. It was Bram's job to make sure that he knew the distances, the timing between all the cities, so that all the trucks would be waiting to pick up all the workers, all the sets that had to move all the way across America. This is why Bram was so accurate in the novel Dracula, with all the train carriage times, the carriages, the boats, all the schedules were right on time, just as they were listed in all the Baedeker guides and everything else. Bram wanted the novel to be accurate. He did it just like he did in real life with the Lyceum Theater. Here is an actual picture of Bram's notes laying out Jonathan Harker's train schedule between London and the Burgo Pass. You can read his writing is not the greatest. London to Paris, Paris to Munich, Munich to Salzburg, Salzburg to Vienna, Vienna to Budapest, Budapest to Klausenburg, Klausenburg to Bistritz, and then to Borgo Pass, about 7 or 8 hours. And at the bottom, leave Paris. So this is his chicken scratch with the time and the times that it would take to go from all these different places. And it all happened accurately in the novel. Another thing that was accurate in the novel, because Bram used his brother, Dr. William Thornley Stoker, who I believe was a model for Dr. Seward, for getting all the medical information just right. So you can see on the left-hand side that he was a medical advisor for Dracula, both the physical side and the psychological side. Thornley Stoker worked both on physical health of people as well as mental health. He was knighted, as was Irving. He was a professor of anatomy at the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, and he helped his brother with the description of the brain damage in the surgery used on Renfield in chapter 21. You can see that diagram for brain trephination surgery over on the right-hand side of the page. He actually did operations on and had great interest in helping people who were insane. And he was an inspector of vivisection. That is the operations done on animals. They cut off the skull and go into the brain while they're still alive of dogs and monkeys to help people who were doing brain surgery, understanding the brain motor functions. And as I said, I think he was the model for Dr. Seward. He actually wrote in the typescript in chapter 10, this is his handwriting. He said he would have been put lying down. That is in chapter 10 when Bram writes about the blood transfusion. Thornley is telling Bram how you would have had the person, whichever the band of heroes was giving blood to Lucy, they would have been lying down. And he also said a transfusion is performed. Usually the blood is drawn from one person and defibrinated before being injected into the other. And I looked up what that was all about back in the late 1800s. That's a cleansing process. They didn't know about blood typing in the day, but at least they were concerned about cleaning the blood. And in chapter 13, when they were going to cut Lucy's head off, and Bram had them using operating knives for the post-mortem, Thornley corrected him and said, no, operating knives would not be used. Sharp metal knives would have been much too valuable to use on a dead person. So these are some of the things his brother helped him with. Now, on these pages, you're actually going to get a glimpse of how Bram plotted out the story. As writers here, I'm not sure how many of you actually do this, taking notes and laying the whole thing out, but you can see, if you're familiar with the novel Dracula, where some of the key things were planned to happen. So in 1892, top left-hand corner of that page on your left, you actually see that this is early in the writing process. He started his research in 1890. By 1892, he was thinking of 3 different books. And obviously that didn't happen. He ended up writing he had them all condensed in one. But you also see on the page on the right, he daytimed the whole novel. And you can kind of see that my notes on the right-hand side, the date of the 3rd bogus letter, the escape of Budapest, Jonathan arrives at the hospice, uneasiness on the ship, and Seward's diary where eats bird, that's obviously Renfield. Bram wanted to make sure that the novel was so well organized and accurate that he daytimed the whole thing. And people have realized that the sequence of the days and the lunar cycles and everything else managed to hit this thing in 1893. So here's another time for audience participation. If you would, if you're interested in trying to answer these questions, write in the chat that Angela is going to then accumulate, and we'll chat at the end. All of these pieces of images you see represent high technology of the day, either emerging sciences or tech that Bram introduced into the story. And I believe he did it in a way to show this is the end of the 1800s. We've got all kinds of new tech coming on, new changes in industry and everything else. We're going to use all these new things as well in the novel. And by God, we better use them. Otherwise, we're going to just fall in the dark ages and let his character, Dracula, bring in his old world, his old philosophies, and his old superstitions. We've got to overpower them with new tech. All of these have been used somewhere in the story. So in the chat, try to write down where any of these things appeared in the novel. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to look at that, and then I'll go on. Okay. So there is one and only one interview I've ever discovered that Bram Stoker gave to one person who asked him, Jane Stoddard, asked him about Dracula. As I said, no autobiography. So I would highly recommend you guys, if you're into this, you can Google British Weekly, Bram Stoker interview Jane Stoddard. I'm only going to tell you 2 things, where she asked him, where did you get this whole idea about the myth of the vampire? And he said, well, a person may have fallen into a death-like trance and been buried before the time. Afterwards, the body may have been dug up and found alive. And from this, a horror seized upon the people, and in their ignorance, they imagined a vampire was about. Well, where did you find all this information? In certain parts of Styria, which was a province of Austria, it survived the longest with the most intensity, but the legend is common to many countries: China, Iceland, Germany, Saxony, Turkey, the Chersonese, Russia, Poland, Italy, France, England, and besides the Tartar communities. So it's a very telling interview, and it's given me lots of insight, because it's the only thing, as I said, that Bram really wrote about his writing of Dracula, and you guys can find it because it's out there on the internet. Now, Bram went to Whitby only once, but this visit that he took during his summer holiday in 1890 changed everything for him. He had just started taking his notes and doing his research on Dracula. He got so enamored with this town, and it looks wonderful during the day. that he set chapter 6, 7, and 8 here. You can see the church there with the abbey in the background, the graveyard off to the left of the church. A close look at it at nighttime, and you can see that whole Gothic vibe that Bram would have picked up. And he did wander through these graveyards, and he took 90 names off the gravestones and used 8 of them in the novel. Swales, Captain Swales being one of them that he took off there. Now, what else he also got, we got out of Bram's holiday, is that the local newspaper, as you see on the right, actually listed all the visitors that would come to Whitby. And so we know in the summer of 1890, Bram Stoker and his wife and son stayed at Mrs. Vesey's guest house on 6 Royal Crescent. And that arrow that I'm pointing at is number 6 Royal Crescent, a guest house. Funnily enough, Bram used exactly the same residence for Lucy and Mrs. Western and Mina Murray to stay in. Once again, one of Bram's tactics to use real places to make the novel seem real. To this day, there is a blue plaque on the same building, and the 3rd floor is a Airbnb apartment called Bram's View that you can stay in. I've actually donated items for them to show there, which is quite cool. The only problem with the blue plaque is the Whitby Civic Society got the dates wrong. Bram was only there once, and he didn't stay there between 1890 and 96. He was there only the summer of 1890, up the coast in Cruden Bay, Scotland, which we'll get to in a little while. He actually stayed there for 11 of his summers. I'm going to skip this slide just because it does show you some cool pictures of Whitby, but because of time, I'm going to jump on to more. These are the 199 steps that are famous in Whitby, and Bram used these for the black dog jumping off Demeter, running up these steps from the beach all the way up to the graveyard that I just showed you. Bram wrote his name in the Whitby Library Ledger, and that was an important day for Bram because he was very curious about things that were going on in the town, and he went into the library, and lucky enough that he did. You can see a picture of the library on the right-hand side, and below it, what it is today, which is called the Quayside Restaurant and Bar. He walked in there that day. He called up a book called The Account of Principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia. And you can see that he found a passage in there about this fellow in the image you see. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. That should take you back to Mephistopheles a few slides ago. The Wallachians were at that time, as they are present, giving themselves as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous either by courage, cruel action, or cunning. Now, Dracula, Count Dracula, is described with these same words, courage, cruel action, or cunning, twice by Van Helsing in the novel. And I'm sure what caught Bram's eye was the devil. Now, Arminius Vanbury was an interesting character that Bram met at a dinner party. And here's the proof. This is the dinner seating arrangement from the beefsteak room behind the Lyceum Theater, where Bram and Irving and the important guests would go after the shows. And this is where he met this guy, Arminius Vanbury, who wrote books, who was a very interesting character, who was actually revealed in 2005 to have been a spy for the Brits against the Russians. You see on the little red line there his name, Vanbury, next to Tom Stoker and Ellen Terry. Bram Stoker is the blue line. And Mr. Grusha, who was the secretary of the Prime Minister of Hungary, was traveling with Vanbury. They came to watch the plays. You see Henry Irving, H.I., is the guy at the head of the table. This is important because this guy is mentioned in the novel. Chapter 18. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but you can look in the blue. You see Van Helsing explaining who this Dracula was. He says, I've asked my friend Arminius of Budapest University to make his record. And from all means they are, he tell me of what he's been. He must indeed have been that Vivoid Dracula. And we go on, who the real Dracula was. So there was this connection between real Vlad the Impaler, his real life that he got out of the Wilkinson book, and also another book I'll show you in a while called From Samuelson. But it does link the Draculas, says Arminius, a great and noble race, links him to being the devil, and down below Satan and hell and so on. So this is how Bram took real information and merged it, massaged it to make a very compelling story and evidence that these two characters, the real Vlad Dracula was in fact a vampire, which he wasn't. This page gives me shivers every time I look at it. I'm going to let it develop for you guys as you breathe it in and enjoy it for about 30, 45 seconds. It is a page that many authors do. It's your list of characters. Look very closely at it, and unfortunately Bram has such bad handwriting that it's hard to decipher it. But I've put notes on the sides of the page and you can see it. What's most significant is the right-hand side of the page where you see Wiater crossed out. And you see that Bram did the same thing. He had listed his count as Vampire, which would have been Austrian for a vampire, and then crossed it out. I believe this page was composed, or parts of it, in Whitby once he went to that library I just showed you, and he changed the name, his count, to Dracula. And he got so excited that he wrote it 3 more times on the upper side of the page. This is the Genesis page for the name Dracula in English literature. And just take a quick scan around, you can see other things that did survive this page. The doctor of the madhouse did have a name, Seward, the girl engaged to him, but the mad patient wasn't called Renfield at the time. He actually had the name in the notes, Flyman, for a while. The lawyer was Peter Hawkins, Jonathan Harker, fiance of Wilhelmina, and so on. The American inventor from Texas, well, Quincy Morris wasn't an inventor, but he merged him with other characters. So this is, as I said, very important page. Drone footage of Whitby Abbey, which actually shows something that J.D. Barker and I used in Dracula, which was the suicide graveyard. You can see in the middle of your screen. You can see the regular graveyard with the unconsecrated graves for suicides outside of the consecrated graveyard. You also see the red line with the path of the Dimitri. Well, the real ship Dimitri, which we're going to see in a minute, that Bram used for the Demeter, came in from the very rough waters inside these piers so they wouldn't get wrecked on the rocks outside of those piers. Many ships, coal ships, did that, and that's why that little area is called Collier's Hope. Now, here's where Bram got the information. This is his notebook. He actually heard about the Russian schooner in October of 1885 called the Dimitri, about 120 tons, was sighted off of Whitby, and so on and so forth, with the weather patterns and so on, that it had a cargo of silver sand from the mouth of the Danube. But he got all this information from the logbook of the Coast Guard station. He also got information about the weather patterns you'll see over on the right-hand side. Bram wanted to get things absolutely accurate for his special supernatural storm that brings in the count. What was Bram doing with all this? Well, as I said, this is the arrival of the count. There have been paintings painted about the Dimitri. Bram actually sketched on the right-hand side of the page this little sketch that shows the Whitby piers, and it shows the cliff, and it shows the beach, and it shows the name Collier's Hope, which is where the ship actually ran up against. Bram didn't start writing the novel for another couple of years, and he took the sketch in 1890 as he did this memo on the left-hand side. You see 151090. So what I've done is I just put a couple of interesting words from some of my favorite chapter along with some of the paintings of the ships coming into Collier's Hope. Bram writes in chapter 7, one of the greatest and most sudden storms on record has just been experienced here, with results both strange and unique. To add to the difficulties and dangers of the time, masses of sea fog came drifting inland, white, wet clouds which swept by in ghostly fashion, so dank and damp and cold that it needed but little effort of imagination to think that the spirits of those lost at sea were touching their living brethren with the clammy hands of death. Now, a friend of mine just this past August sent me this picture of a fog bank rolling in to Whitby off of the North Sea. And people in town still believe, to a certain extent, that these fog banks represent the spirits of those dead, the spirits of those whose souls are unrest, that are coming to looking for their place to rest in peace. And what Bram found in the graveyard was something interesting, that Whitby was a sailing town, a whaling town. Many people who were sailing around the world for their jobs lost their lives in foreign places. Their bodies were never brought back to Whitby, yet their families would have a grave for them and a headstone, as if they were waiting for their spirit to come and rest in peace, something that caught Bram's imagination. It was also mentioned by Swales to Lucy and Mina. And here we see some of that fog bank, the spirits of the souls of those looking for their eternal rest in peace. Here's an image of how the ships would enter into the piers, and an excerpt from, again, that chapter 7. The searchlight followed her, this is the Dimitri, and a shudder ran through all who saw her, for lashed to the helm was a corpse with its drooping head, which swung horribly to and fro at each motion of the ship. No other form could be seen on deck at all. A great awe came on all as they realized that the ship, as if by a miracle, had found the harbor unsteered save by the hand of a dead man. One of my most favorite passages of the story, and the fact that it's based on reality makes it even better. And here is the actual picture of the Dimitri that was in the Whitby newspaper. Good chance Bram saw it. It wasn't in his notebook, but good chance that he was. But what was in his notebook was the left-hand side of your page, the details of wrecks of Whitby. He was obviously given this page taken out by one of the Coast Guardmen that detailed the wreck of the Dimitri. Bram used those words almost word for word. And the other thing Bram did was he had Count Dracula jump off the ship, not as a bat or a wolf, but as a black dog, to follow the local myth of the Begashed, the black dog of the Moors. Now, the whole story obviously doesn't take part just in Whitby. It takes part in Romania. So I'm going to try to zip through this part and show you some of the evidence that I have that Bram actually wrote the novel by information that he got from the London Library books. And as you can see, the British tabloids wrote, Dracula writer with a sucker for defacing books. And I got there, Philip Spedding, as you can see, when I did a book signing there holding Dracula, he said, Dacre, don't worry. We're not really upset about this. He did deface the books, but now it gives us great credibility that Bram used our library as his ground zero for his research. You can see Bram actually wrote Mesmerist right next to MD, where my red arrow is pointing. This is a book about popular superstitions and mesmerism by Herbert Mayo, the medical doctor. And look at some of the names of the chapters that I've underlined in red. Vampirism, unreal ghost, true ghost, trance sleep, half walking, trance or symbolism. So all these ideas that were kicking around in Bram's head as a young boy listening to superstitions and Irish folklore and color of victims and so on were rooted in reality. And this is one of the books that was written about it by a real medical doctor, not just some crazy quack. Another book, The Other World, or Glimpses of Supernatural Being Facts, Records, and Tradition, written by Reverend Frederick George Lee, who was a Church of England priest, which I found interesting. If a priest in those days was writing about the supernatural, what does that tell us? Where's his allegiance? Bram puts a little pencil mark on this passage that I just love it. And I know when I read this, it's another hint towards Bram choosing the devil as his model for Count Dracula. It is commonly held in lonely deserts on lofty mountains, where the feet of men seldom tread, as well as in the mines of the earth, and in vast forests where desolation reigns, the powers of the devil and his angels being unchecked and uncurbed by the positive energizing activity of Christianity are vast. That's why I believe Bram set his story, his Dracula's castle in northeastern Transylvania, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where there are mines and vast forests where desolation reigns, and the power of the devil and their superstition is secure. He founds another book called Superstition, enforced by the American writer Henry Charles Lee. He puts a check mark. Volcanoes have always been objects of superstitious fear. They were supposed to be produced by subterranean gods who reside in the interior of the earth. And I believe this is what motivated him to write chapter 24. The very place where he had been alive, this is Mina talking about Dracula, undead for all these centuries, is full of strangeness of the geologic and chemical world. There are deep caverns and fissures that reach none know whither. There have been volcanoes, some of whose openings still send out waters of strange properties and gases that kill or make vivify. Now, in that same library, there were books about Vesuvius and the mysterious eruptions coming from the center of the earth, which people in those days believed were the portal to hell. And Luigi Palmieri, the Italian physicist, wrote this book about Vesuvius, and Bram Stoker quotes it. I would that my old friend Palmieri of Naples were here, and with him his wonderful seismograph, for he could give me some clue as what was happening or about to happen. Whatever it is, as the ground is hardening to receive it. Van Helsing says in the last chapter of the book, as they're closing in to find where Count Dracula's castle is, the band of heroes chasing him back. They've got to cut him off before he gets to his castle, which is, as you'll find out, sitting on an extinct volcano, the portal to hell, the home of the devil. Now, just as a bit of a summary point, what we've got here is Bram's identified Vlad Dracula III as his source of background and history. He's merged him with his devil character as Mephistopheles to create his own sort of count. He's actually pulled this information from two books, one by William Wilkinson, and the other by a lawyer actually called James Samuelson, who mentions that Vlad Dracula goes by the name of the devil. Two sources citing him as the devil. And now we get to one of the books that had a map. Now, Bram did not, draw on this map. I did. I actually purchased the same copies of these books that were in the London Library. I photocopied the map, and I drew this tracing Jonathan Harker's voyage from Klausenburg to Bistrica. And look at that, the Borgo Pass, where I've got the red arrow and the black arrow, not made up by Bram. It's actually a real place in northeastern Transylvania. And if you see my arrow at the bottom right, it points to Kelemen Isvarar. That's actually the location of the fictional castle, because Bram actually listed the coordinates to us. But before we get to that, we got to give a nod to Emily Gerard, the Scottish writer who actually gave Bram all the superstitions he needed to understand about Transylvanian vampires. She mentioned the names Strigoi and Nosferatu in this book, Land Beyond the Forest. And she actually said exactly how Bram was to get Van Helsing and the boys to learn how to kill Count Dracula. And she says in the note, you can see there, if you could read Bram's writing, to kill a vampire, drive a stake through the corpse or fire a pistol shot into the coffin, cut off the head and replace in the coffin with mouthful of garlic and extract the heart and burn it or strew ashes over the grave. You see some imagery of the day that shows that people were very concerned and were following some of those very same rituals and superstitions. Now, these are other sources that Bram actually had. This one, a very famous one by Dom Augustin Calmet, which is investigations in the late 1700s by the church to find out why are people actually going about taking bodies out of the graves and doing these exhumations to stop vampirism. This one on the far right, Mascatory Moratorium, is actually Latin for the chewing dead. And these were people being misinterpreted as being vampires. They were actually plague victims. And as they would decompose, their jaws would crunch down. And because the graves were very shallow, because it was in Venice, people who were living on the upside of the graves could hear a crunching noise as these jaws would crunch down. So they exhumed bodies and found these bodies bloated, blood dripping from their mouths and their nose. And they assumed that this bloated body was actually sucking the blood from those living and, of course, making them ill and eventually dying. So what do? They would stick bricks in their mouths. So I'm going to zip on past this because this is from a PBS special, highly recommended, called Secrets of the Dead, Vampire Legend. But because of time, I just want to get on with this and show you some of the other treaties that Bram had access to. Look at the dates, all of them around the same time in the 1700s. Plagues were going through Europe and people were misunderstanding these plague diseases because they didn't quite understand germ theory, and this is what they thought was vampirism. And that's the ending of the same clip from Secrets of the Dead, PBS, Vampire Legend. Funnily enough, Bram did not only have to rely on medieval documents, he relied upon a newspaper clipping for the New York World from 1896. When he's almost finished writing Dracula, these notes were in his Rosenbach notes. And what it does was it talks about Charles Darwin, who had written Origin of the Species, and it was published in 1859, not long before Dracula was actually written or started to be written in 1890. And he discovered the vampire bat. And he actually said, in South America, we were there in Chile, and we found these vampire bats coming out of the trees, drinking blood from the cattle. Well, Bram used this and almost plagiarized and took those words and used them coming out of Quincy Morris's mouth when he said, yes, when we were in South America, these big bats would come out of the trees and drink so much blood from my famous mare. She went to grass. I had to put her down. So this is, I'm sure, gold for Bram, who found there was a contemporary vampire scare in the New England states during 1896. Over 50 exhumations were approved by the different states. That meant people believed it was real. And here was Bram writing a contemporary vampire novel. This was gold because he realized, my God, this is really happening in North America. What a lucky guy. So he goes on to take all these different treaties that you saw, and he gathers different traits from different vampire stories. And as you can see, he uses them in the novel to give Dracula many different traits: influence over rats, painters cannot reproduce him, never see him reflect the mirror, and so on and so forth. And what I want to just get close to the end here now, I just want to tell you, this is where Bram actually spent 11 of his summer holidays. This is where he actually wrote Dracula. I've been there a number of times. And some cool insight, you can see the plaque that I had erected on the wall of the one hotel in town where Bram stayed. But the castle that Bram visited is the top right hand. That's what it looked like in the day. But what it looks like to this day, because it's a ruin now, that the family ran out of money and that to sell it off and everything was stripped out, that exposed a very interesting octagonal room smack in the middle of the castle. In chapter 2, Bram wrote Jonathan Harker walking into Castle Dracula. The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, and crossing the room, opened another door, which led into a small octagonal room, lit by a single lamp and seemingly without a window of any sort. Passing through this, he opened another door and motioned me to enter. It was a welcome sight. Well, there's the octagonal room. And if you reread what I just said, it's exactly the way somebody would walk into Slane's castle. I'm sure the same way Bram did. So this is the castle he used for part of the internal layout of his castle Dracula. And there is the single lamp. I gave this lecture at the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel a few years ago. And a man stood up in the back and said, "I'm a Robert Hay. It's my family that used to own the castle. When we stripped everything down, I got the single lamp, the one that you just described in Dracula. And that single lamp is there in that octagonal room. It now sits in Mr. Robert Hay's home in London, England." Now, just before I finish here, I want to tell you something. Bram Stoker made darn sure that he protected the dramatic rights of his novel by having a staged reading. If you ever hear that someone says, Bram Stoker had a poor performance of Dracula, only 2 people showed up, it wasn't a proper performance. It was a staged reading, and it was done just to protect the dramatic rights. And that's something that he did by cutting and pasting. You can see that script on the right-hand side. And he left those rights, obviously, to his wife. And it kind of brings us full circle because years later, 10 years after Bram died, Florence Stoker was able to capitalize on this whole thing and sold the rights to Hamilton Dean and John Balderston, and then Universal Film, and the rest is history. Here's a picture of Bram near the end of his life, sadly. Irving died in 1905. Bram lived for 7 more years. And Bram was out of a job. This is when Irving died at this theater. Bram had to shut down operations and go ahead and take care of the funeral arrangements for Henry Irving. So this is one of the last paintings of Bram. This is where he's buried, Golders Green Crematorium. He was cremated. His ashes are with his son in this urn, and you see the death certificate. But there's one final little piece to show you guys how the changed ending of Dracula helped reveal to me the location of the fictional castle. Well, all my research has brought me to Transylvania a number of times and to Bran Castle, and many people call it Dracula's castle. And the only reason it's really associated with Dracula is that this sketch you see on the right-hand side, along with one other, was in one of those books in the London Library. In fact, it was the only castle in any of the sketches. So I'm convinced, as I read Bram's description of the castle, this is the castle that he used to describe the exterior of Castle Dracula, and the interior is the one in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And what's more interesting is Bram left us these very notes that show the coordinates, and here's a close-up of them, that got me and one other guy, Hans de Roos, to confirm that the location of his fictional Castle Dracula that you see here, River Sereth runs into, and River Bistritza runs into Sereth at Fundu between Strasha and Israel, is 47 east longitude, 25 3/4 north latitude. And what's interesting, folks, is that that is actually an extinct volcano. And here is the picture on the actual map that Bram had in the back of his book, and the arrows are pointing at the location of the 47th parallel, where the gypsies and the band of heroes have the fight just before they get to Castle Dracula. Here is a modern day map of it. Here's me and my son at the top of the mountain, Mount Israel in the Columbine National Park, putting a canister with sort of notes in different languages. You see the red arrow over on the right-hand side of the peak that we chose to go to, and that's a peak that Bram was looking at. Once again, to kind of sum things up, Bram used this castle for his exterior, and we'll just put it there. He used this castle for his interior, and that's the location where these map coordinates bring everything together. And finally, you get to see what was extracted out of the tripe script. And this was just after Jonathan Harker and Quincy Morris stabbing the Count with the Bowie knife, and Harker slitting his throat with the kukri blade. Count Dracula crumbles into dust. And what would have been published in the book, had this part not been edited out, is a massive volcanic eruption. And I hope you've enjoyed getting to know Bram a little bit. As detail-oriented a man as he was a clerk of petty sessions and a theater manager, and as a writer, he was so detail-oriented in my mind that if he was going to have a volcanic eruption, by golly, he was going to be on a volcano. And now there is a plaque there that I've placed there, much like the one I did in Cruden Bay. And here's the plaque showing the location. And here's my last slide showing the 120th anniversary just 2 years ago. So Angela, that wraps up. If you want to unshare the slide, and if you want to do any questions, now would be a good time for it. And unfortunately, I can't hear her.
Sorry, that was me muted.
Okay, good. Now we're good.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I didn't have any noise during the presentation, but thank you so much for that. That was so fascinating. The questions we're not transcribing over, and unfortunately, we probably don't have time to get through all of them, but I'm going to just pick through. Do you want me to read the list of what came through, and then you decide what you want to answer?
How about you just randomly, you're an author, just randomly see what you think the group would like to hear, read the question, and as many as you want, I'll go with it.
Okay, that sounds great. One that I thought was really interesting, every author has their own writing rituals. Do you know of any of Bram Stoker's rituals, and how do they compare to your own?
You know, I don't know. Again, Bram died in 1912, long before I was born. Here's what I think, and here's a couple that I do know. I know he only wrote in the summer holidays. He did his research when he could, when he was in London. But I know that there was a newspaper report in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where I've taken tours there a couple times. There was a 2-mile beach. And Bram, to get into his headspace, would walk on the beach 2 miles up and 2 miles back every day in the morning. And he would just, they said he sort of walked, and he had a big flapping coat on, and sometimes it would blow with the wind, the Scottish wind, like a big bat. And he would also sit in remote places. There was one place in particular we know for sure at low tide, and there was the big castle up on the cliff. And that's how he got his peace and quiet and serenity, you know, much like we do. And to me, being an athlete, as Bram was, I usually go for a walk or a mountain bike ride, some kind of physical activity, take a nice shower, and then I can kind of deflate and let all those other little worries get away. And that's when I get in my headspace for writing. So I do think I maybe share a little bit of that with Uncle Bram.
That's awesome. And it gives me chills a little bit to hear you say Uncle Bram.
Me too. Trust me, me too.
How about what was the significance of the yellow cover? And I believe that's referring to the beginning when you showed all the different types of books.
Yeah. Did anybody try to answer it?
No, nobody tried to answer it. Nobody knew.
It's a tough one, but you know, to cut to the chase here, yellow back in the day was the color of decomposition and degeneration. So if you think about this, was described by me by a forensic archaeologist, that when you get a bad bruise, it goes blue, it goes kind of reddish, green, and then yellow as the blood decomposes. So decomposition and also degeneration of sort of moral degeneration, of dealing with such horrible things as the living dead, the undead. This book really shocked the reviewers. And so that whole idea of degeneration, people were kind of weirded out that Bram Stoker, the upstanding conservative theater manager, would write such a thing. But what I love is the backup. You see other people were doing it too in those books in the London Library, giving Bram those ideas.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And that's a really good perspective. So this is a good question to follow up with. Dracula was really progressive for the time. I didn't realize there was so much modern thought for the Victorian era.
Yeah, somebody said the Victorian era, at least the end of the 1800s, there was more industrial changes than at any time on Earth. And with that, there was more thought, but there was more conflicting thoughts. There was great conflict between the eroding power of strict religion and the emerging power of science and advanced thinking. That's why we get Freemasonry, Golden Dawn, Hellfire Club, all these secret societies where these people could think and not be ostracized by their priest or their vicar or whoever else. So it was a great time of change, great time of, thinking and advancement and everything else. But still, there was a very conservative sort of world that people were rattling around in. And Bram certainly ruffled feathers. It was also Jack the Ripper time, scaring the hell out of people and distrust in the police that they could keep them safe. So all this was this melting pot of strange things going on with great advancements and money and everything else was just, really overpowering society.
Wow, that is a really good perspective. That's interesting. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more questions. I think we'll actually get through them.
You pick them, yeah.
Can you tell me more about what it was like to find Bram Stoker's journal?
Oh, well,
I bet that was magical.
It was one of those moments. It would be cool to sort of like be on one of those, reality shows where you're crawling through a cave or something. But I was looking, doing my research on Dracula the Undead, and I traveled to England, meet my cousin. Hey guys, you got any really interesting stuff? And we sold these papers here. Have you been to Trinity? Yes. You've been to the Rosenbach? Yeah, all that. See, but do you have it? Yes, I think we do. We've got some things. And one of them started pulling some boxes out of the attic. And he opened up this box and it had this kind of moldy leather covered thing, opened it up. The pages, the glue had come unstuck. Obviously, it's over 100 years old, sitting in an attic. And the writing I could easily identify quickly because I had studied the heck out of the Dracula notes. It was obviously Bram's writing. And a few of the things were dated. 1871 was the earliest dated piece. And it was like, oh my God.
Wow.
This is the missing link. Is there anything in Dracula here? But there was also like, we don't know much about Bram. No autobiography, letters, yes, but nothing that really gets into his own head, what he was like, what he was thinking. So it wasn't a journal that was, this day I'm going to play rugby here. It is more of a commonplace book that he'd jot down ideas, much like everybody probably listening here. We might have a Word file or a Pages file or a phone or a notebook. You just keep ideas for stories. And it was so cool. I got Elizabeth Miller quickly on the phone and I got pictures taken of every single page, brought them back to North America, not the book, but the photos. And since she had deciphered the Dracula notes, it took us about a year to decipher everything else to fully understand what we had found.
Oh,
and
wow.
it was published in 2012 by a wonderful company in England because we needed the copyright protection of books in England by writers that have been dead more than 50 years. And now it's published in paperback, available on Amazon. So it's much cheaper now and a really cool insight into Bram. So really pivotal moment in my life, giving me understanding how Bram was wired. Really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. What is the book called that you can get on Amazon so you can actually hold these notes?
Yeah, Bram Stoker's Lost Journal.
Okay.
And everything you see in it that's in italics is Bram's notes as he wrote it. We wrote commentary, Elizabeth Miller and I did, on different parts, different sections of those notes. I added a timeline. My wife dug around and did really good footnotes whenever Bram mentioned a person or a place. So just like you said, Angela, put things in perspective to this notebook that was kept for 11 years from a man who was still in university until he was working for Irving, and all the perspective that he just had as an emerging writer. There was some poetry in there. There was some romance. There was some horror, all kinds of cool stuff.
Oh, that's amazing. And the fact that, thank you for transcribing that to bring it so that everybody, while we don't get the excitement of finding the moldy leather, that's still pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I just felt it's part of my duty to share it with the world. It's just sitting in that box. It needs to get out there.
Yeah, I think everybody agrees. I have another question. This is for you. What is your favorite version of Dracula? I guess in all the fictional renditions of him.
Yeah, well, there's fictional version on screen. I mean, look, I said earlier, the 1997 Louis Jourdan BBC version, 3-part miniseries, most faithful, but it's 97. It's 77. It's dated. I like the 92 Coppola with Gary Oldman. Not particularly faithful to the novel. Most people say, oh, it's the most faithful. Garbage. It certainly is not, because Jim Hart, who's a good friend of mine, the screenwriter now, he said, look, I had to make it into a love story. In 92, we had Interview the Vampire. We had Salem's Lot. We had, we had to really give a hook to turn Dracula into something romantic. So he made up the whole idea of reincarnated Mina being Vlad Dracula's lost wife. That's okay. And he had good actors, and he went back to the epistolary style. So I like that, but it's not the most faithful. So those are the two that I kind of put side by side that are pretty damn good. That's awesome.
That's awesome. I think Frank Langella, that's always the Dracula to me. I love that.
Great scene, by the way, Angela. Langella, I think, is the best death scene when he's hooked in the back and the cord is pulled up by Harker and he hits the sunlight, and he has this very animalistic squealing and grunting as he is being burned by the sun, which incidentally is not a Bram Stoker thing, but it works.
And it just stayed.
Absolutely.
I have a comment. This is also interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think everybody has been utterly fascinated. And then can you explain day timing some more? I think that was
day timing is using a day timer to sequence everything in the story, just to get it, all the days line up. So he actually had the physical day timer. Lucy goes here. It takes this long for a letter to go here to here. So everything was absolutely accurate with its sequencing and timing.
That is amazing, because it is so detailed, but I never caught that. Now I have to go reread that just so I can, knowing that.
So hold on a second. My computer just told me I'm on low battery, so let me go quickly plug it in. Yeah, that's okay. Just going to do a little plug.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for sending in these great questions and for watching this and for supporting the Halloween in July fundraiser for the HWA. All of this, everything that you're donating is going to support scholarships.
There we go. I'm back on. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that's why I'm donating my time. I think it's really important to support the HWA and up-and-coming writers in the scholarship program. So good plug. Any more questions so we can let people get to their dinner tonight?
I have one final question, and this is, can you tell us about some of your books?
Oh, that's nice. So all this research that you've heard over the past 12 years, I've kind of used it in a way to, capitalize on things either Bram left out of the story or let people know more about Bram. So the first book was Dracula the Undead, which is actually a continuation of Dracula, but 25 years after it ends. That came out in 2009, published by Penguin and All Over the World, which is great success, which was cool, with the help of Ian Holt and Alexander Gallant. And then The Lost Journal was next in line, which you've already heard about. And then Dracula, you see over my shoulder, is a prequel to Dracula. I kind of did the Star Wars thing. I found so many cool things in my research and approached J.D. Barker, fellow member of the Horror Writers, who now writes for James Patterson. So I got him at the right time. And we wanted to tell the story of Bram's life. many things that you guys just heard. The sick young Bram. How was he healed? Well, I took that little piece of maybe he was bloodlet, or maybe there was some kind of supernatural intervention, and with that pulled in the actual nanny that the Stokers really had, and made Bram's writing of Dracula, since it was so realistic, a warning to the world that vampires are real. So those are sort of the big novels. I've also just come out with Dracula Annotated for the 125th anniversary. It came out a year and a half ago. It's got all the things that I've been mentioning that were taken out of the typescript. All those things taken out, like that passage you saw, are underlined, so you can see what was taken out. And I've recreated the first 3 chapters.
That's
amazing.
amazing.
Also about to come out. The last thing I'll say is, in October, what's coming out is an NFT edition of Dracula, a digital edition. One of these things where there's only going to be 666 copies. And what I'm really thrilled to say to fellow authors is that this thing will be sold and resold. So if you were to buy a copy of it, you get all of my annotations visually. You get 160 videos. You get 44 of Rosenbach's notes. You get ongoing things in your wallet for 2 years, and then you can sell the book. And if you sell it, you choose the price. But what's so cool about this whole project is that the publisher and the author gets 10% commission every time it's resold.
Oh, wow.
So think about that as fellow authors. If you could do this, Book Volts is my publisher in England. They're just getting started with this. They're passionate about helping authors profit in some way from the ongoing sales of your book.
That's amazing.
So it's a big deal. So follow that and follow me on that, because I'll be posting more about it, and I will be loving to direct more of my fellow authors to these types of projects where you can supplement your novel with little videos, just like we're doing right here. In the back of a book, since it's digitized, what does Dacre think about this? What does Dacre think of this book? What does Angela, where did she get her inspiration? How did she win her award? And you get to talk. But then the beauty is when it gets resold, and hopefully the value goes up from $33, which we'll be selling these more, you get to make money. It's an investment, but also the author and the publisher make a little money down the road. So that's
which is fair. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is awesome. I have one question just from me. I'm looking at the yellow cover over your shoulder. Is that a first edition?
No, I have a first edition, but I don't leave it on the shelf. That's actually a reproduction that Archibald Constable did in at the 100th anniversary of the novel in 1997. And I carry that around. I bring it to different places and do talks with it and read from it. But I'll just end with this. One of the coolest things that I do have, I talk about my cousins with the Lost Journal. I've been passed down a first edition that Bram actually signed to his mother 4 days before the original publication date. And then she gave it to one of her other sons. He signed it. He gave it to his wife. It was given to my father. And I'm the custodian of it. I loan it to museums, to libraries when they're having big exhibits. And it goes around the world. It cannot be insured because it's priceless. So they normally hire me or give me a plane ticket to take it to Taiwan, to Milan, to Finland, to cool places where I give a little lecture and I allow them to keep it for 6 months, and then they fly me back to go get it.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. So much amazing, wonderful information. Thank you for being so generous with your time. And thank you for being so generous with Bram Stoker and sharing him with the world and continuing to enlighten us, and the insights and all of that. It's invaluable because it's, obviously the namesake of StokerCon, of,
Absolutely.
the HWA. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, he's our patron saint when it comes to the award. So I was telling that to Max, and good for you guys for organizing this. And once again, thank you for Maxwell, our new executive director, and for you, our tech person and fellow author, to help pull this all together. And everybody watching, thank you all very much, and appreciate your interest in our man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Whether you attended live or whether you caught this on the replay, we appreciate it. Now go donate to Halloween in July and support our scholarships.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
All right. Good night, all. Take care.